The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Lake as David Miller pulled his truck into the gravel driveway of his family cabin. The rustic structure had been in his family for 3 generations and represented everything he valued about peaceful weekend retreats away from the chaos of city life. What David didn't know was that this particular Saturday would forever change his relationship with both his property and the surrounding community. David had inherited the cabin from his grandfather 2 years earlier, along with the 3 acres of pristine lakefront property that surrounded it. The deed was clear and had been verified multiple times by his attorney, but recently the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association had been making increasingly aggressive claims about his land. The HOA insisted that his property fell under their jurisdiction. Despite the fact that his cabin predated their establishment by decades, the conflict had started small, with polite letters suggesting he considered joining their association for the good of the community. When David politely declined, explaining that his property was not part of their development, these letters became more insistent. Soon they escalated to demands that he comply with their architectural guidelines and pay their monthly fees. Had ignored most of these communications, but lately the HOA president, Margaret Thompson, had become increasingly hostile. Margaret Thompson was a woman in her late 50s who had moved to the Pine Ridge development 5 years earlier after retiring. From a career in corporate management, she had quickly positioned herself as the unofficial guardian of property values and community standards. Her approach to HOA leadership was aggressive and uncompromising, and she had made it her personal mission to bring every property within a 5-mile radius under the association's control. The previous week, Margaret had appeared at David's cabin, unannounced, while he was splitting firewood. She had marched onto his property without permission and began taking photographs of what she called violations. When David asked her to leave, she had become belligerent, claiming that as HOA president, she had the authority to inspect any property in the area. David had firmly but politely escorted her to the property line and told her not to return without his permission. That confrontation had apparently not deterred Margaret in the slightest. If anything, it seemed to have emboldened her. David had received a certified letter 3 days later claiming that his cabin was in violation of multiple HOA covenants and that he had 30 days to bring the property into compliance or face legal action. The letter was filled with references to architectural standards, paint colors, landscaping requirements, and maintenance obligations that had nothing to do with his property. David had immediately contacted his attorney, who had assured him that the HOA had no legal authority over his land. The lawyer had drafted a response explaining the legal boundaries and demanding that the HOA cease their harassment. However, David suspected that Margaret Thompson was not the type to be deterred by legal technicalities. He had a feeling that this morning's visit to his cabin might not be as peaceful as he had hoped. As David unloaded his weekend supplies from the truck, he noticed a black sedan parked along the main road near his property entrance. The car had government plates, which struck him as odd for a Saturday morning in this rural area. He made a mental note to keep an eye on it, but didn't think much more about it as he carried his groceries and fishing gear toward the cabin. The cabin itself was a testament to 3 generations of careful maintenance and gradual improvements. David's grandfather had built the original structure in the 1940s, using local timber and traditional construction methods. David's father had added electricity and indoor plumbing in the 1970s, along with a small addition that served as a master bedroom. David himself had recently updated the kitchen and installed new windows while carefully preserving the cabin's rustic character. The property around the cabin was equally well maintained. David took pride in keeping the grounds clean and the forest paths clear while preserving the natural beauty of the lakefront. He had installed a small dock for fishing and had built a fire pit near the water's edge, where he enjoyed evening campfires. Every improvement had been made with respect for the environment and the property's natural character. As David began settling in for the weekend, he reviewed the documents his attorney had provided regarding the HOA dispute. The paperwork clearly established that his property had never been part of the Pine Ridge development and therefore was not subject to HOA authority. The original deed from the 1940s predated the development by 40 years, and there was no legal mechanism by which the HOA could assert control over his land, the Pine Ridge. Development itself had been built in the 1980s on formerly agricultural land. About a mile from David's cabin, the developers had created a community of upscale homes with strict architectural guidelines and mandatory HOA membership. The development had been successful and property values remained high, but the HOA had developed a reputation for aggressive enforcement of their rules and frequent disputes with neighbors. Margaret Thompson had moved to Pine Ridge specifically because she appreciated the strict community standards and active HOA enforcement. She had quickly volunteered for the board and had been elected president within 2 years. Under her leadership, HOA had expanded their enforcement activities and had begun asserting authority over properties that were not technically within their jurisdiction. David understood that Margaret's motivations were not entirely unreasonable. She genuinely believed that maintaining high standards for all properties in the area would preserve property values for everyone. However, her methods were heavy-handed, and her legal understanding was questionable. She seemed to believe that good intentions justified aggressive tactics, and that community standards trumped individual property rights. The situation had become more complex when other Pine Ridge residents began supporting Margaret's efforts to bring David's property under HOA control. Many of them had invested significant money in their homes and were concerned that a non-conforming property might affect their property values. They convinced themselves that David's rustic cabin was somehow detrimental to their community, even though it was barely visible from the development, and had been there decades before their homes were built. David had tried to reason with the HOA board, explaining that his cabin was well maintained and posed no threat to anyone's property values. He had invited them to visit and see for themselves that the property was cared for and that his activities were quiet and respectful of the environment. However, Margaret had dismissed these overtures and had continued her campaign to force compliance with HOA rules that didn't legally apply to his property. The conflict had reached a tipping point the previous month when Margaret had organized a group of Pine Ridge residents to attend a county planning meeting where David was seeking a permit for minor cabin improvements. The group had opposed his permit application, claiming that his property was not in compliance with community standards. Their objections had been ruled invalid by the Planning Commission, but the experience had convinced David that Margaret would not give up easily. David's attorney had advised him that the best strategy was to continue documenting the HOA's harassment, while avoiding any actions that might escalate the conflict. The lawyer had explained that Margaret's tactics were legally questionable and that continued aggressive behavior might actually strengthen David's position if legal action became necessary. However, David was becoming frustrated with the constant pressure and was beginning to consider more assertive responses. As David unpacked his supplies and began preparing for a relaxing weekend at the cabin, he tried to put the HOA conflict out of his mind. He had planned to spend the day fishing and reading with a campfire in the evening. The weather was perfect, and the lake was calm with just enough breeze to keep the insects at bay. This was exactly the kind of peaceful retreat that made all the stress and conflict worthwhile. However, David's plans for a quiet weekend were about to be dramatically interrupted. Unknown to him, Margaret Thompson was at that very moment preparing for what she considered a decisive confrontation. She had convinced herself that David was hiding something about his property, and that a surprise inspection would reveal violations that would support the HOA's legal case. Margaret had recruited 2 other Pine Ridge residents to accompany her on what she was calling an enforcement action. She had prepared a detailed checklist of potential violations and had brought a camera to document what she expected to find. In her mind, this was not trespassing, but rather a legitimate exercise of HOA authority to protect community standards. What Margaret didn't know was that David was not alone at the cabin that morning. The black sedan with government plates belonged to Robert Williams, the state attorney general of the state. Robert was David's college roommate and longtime friend who had agreed to spend a quiet weekend at the cabin discussing some legal matters unrelated to the HOA dispute. Robert Williams was a respected public servant who had built his career on protecting property rights and ensuring that government authority was exercised within proper legal boundaries. He had little patience for organizations that overstepped their authority, or individuals who used harassment tactics to achieve their goals. His presence at the cabin was purely social, but his legal expertise and official position would soon become very relevant to the unfolding situation. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would expose the fundamental flaws in Margaret Thompson's approach to community leadership. Her assumption that aggressive tactics and self-appointed authority could override legal property rights was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The peaceful morning at Pine Lake was about to become a lesson in the limits of HOA power and the importance of respecting individual rights. David finished his unpacking and was beginning to prepare coffee when he heard his friend Robert's car pulling into the driveway. Robert Williams stepped out of the black sedan with government plates, looking relaxed and ready for a weekend away from the pressures of his official duties. The two men had maintained their friendship since college, despite their different career paths, and Robert always enjoyed the opportunity to spend time at the cabin. Robert was in his early 50s with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. As State Attorney General, he dealt daily with complex legal issues and high-stakes political situations, but he valued his friendship with David precisely because it offered an escape from those pressures. The cabin represented a place where he could simply be Robert the person rather than Robert the public official. The two friends greeted each other warmly, and David explained the situation with the HOA while they prepared breakfast together. Robert listened with increasing interest and concern as David described Margaret Thompson's escalating harassment campaign. As the state's chief law enforcement officer, Robert had seen similar situations before, and he recognized the pattern of an organization overstepping its legal authority. Robert's professional experience had taught him that disputes like this one often reflected deeper problems with how some HOAs operated. While most homeowners associations served legitimate purposes and operated within proper legal boundaries, others had developed cultures of aggressive enforcement that sometimes crossed into harassment or even illegal behavior. The situation David was describing raised several red flags from a legal perspective. As they discussed the HOA conflict over breakfast, Robert reviewed the documentation that David's attorney had prepared. The legal position seemed clear-cut to Robert's experienced eye. The HOA had no legal authority over David's property, and their continued harassment campaign could potentially constitute a violation of David's civil rights. Margaret Thompson's behavior was not just annoying, it was potentially actionable under state law. Robert explained to David that property rights were fundamental to American law, and that organizations like HOAs derive their authority from voluntary agreements among property owners. When an HOA attempted to assert authority over property that had never been subject to their covenants, they were essentially attempting to seize private property rights without legal justification. Such behavior could have serious legal consequences for the individuals involved. The two friends finished their breakfast and decided to spend the morning fishing from David's dock. The lake was perfectly calm, and the weather was ideal for a relaxing day on the water. Robert had brought his fishing gear and was looking forward to the simple pleasure of casting a line without thinking about legal briefs or political pressures. David was equally eager to enjoy his friend's company and forget about HOA's problems for a while. As they walked toward the dock with their fishing equipment, neither man was aware that Margaret Thompson was at that moment driving toward the cabin with two other Pine Ridge residents. Margaret had spent the previous evening studying what she believed were relevant HOA enforcement procedures and had convinced herself that she had not only the right, but the duty to conduct an immediate inspection of David's property. Margaret's companions for this enforcement action were Bill Anderson and Carol Foster, both longtime Pine Ridge residents who shared her concerns about maintaining community standards. Bill was a retired engineer who had moved to Pine Ridge specifically because of the strict HOA rules, and had become increasingly frustrated with what he saw as David's refusal to cooperate with reasonable community standards. Carol was a real estate agent who worried that non-conforming properties might affect sales in the development. The three Pine Ridge residents had convinced themselves that they were acting in the best interests of the entire community. They genuinely believed that bringing David's property under HOA control would benefit everyone involved, including David himself. Their good intentions, however, did not change the legal reality that they were planning to trespass on private property and assert authority they did not possess. Margaret had prepared extensively for what she expected to be a decisive confrontation. She had brought copies of the HOA covenants, architectural guidelines, and enforcement procedures, along with a camera and notebook for documenting violations. She had also prepared what she considered to be compelling arguments about community standards and property values that she expected would convince David to voluntarily comply with HOA requirements. What Margaret had not prepared for was the possibility that David might not be alone at the cabin, or that her actions might be witnessed by someone with the legal expertise and official authority to immediately recognize the problematic nature of her behavior. Her assumption that she could control that situation through force of personality and claimed authority was about to be severely tested. David and Robert had been fishing from the dock for about an hour when they heard the sound of vehicles approaching the cabin. David looked up to see Margaret Thompson's SUV, followed by another car turning into his driveway without permission. His heart sank as he realized that his peaceful weekend was about to be interrupted by another confrontation with the aggressive HOA president. Robert noticed the change in David's expression and asked what was wrong. When David explained that the HOA president was apparently making another uninvited visit to his property, Robert's demeanor immediately shifted from relaxed friend to alert law enforcement professional. He suggested that they walk back toward the cabin to see what Margaret wanted, while making it clear that he would be observing the situation carefully. The two men secured their fishing gear and walked up from the dock toward the cabin, where they could see Margaret Thompson and her companions getting out of their vehicles. Margaret was already taking photographs of the cabin and grounds, while Bill Anderson was consulting what appeared to be a checklist. Carol Foster was taking notes and looking around the property with the critical eye of someone conducting an inspection. David felt his anger rising as he watched the three people wandering around his property without permission, but Robert quietly advised him to remain calm and let the situation develop naturally. Robert's experience had taught him that people who overstepped their authority often revealed the extent of their misconduct when they felt confident and unopposed. He was curious to see exactly how far Margaret Thompson would go in asserting illegitimate authority. Margaret noticed David and Robert approaching and immediately adopted an aggressive posture. She clearly intended to establish her authority over the situation. She announced loudly that she was conducting an official HOA inspection and that David was required to cooperate with her investigation of multiple covenant violations. Her tone was imperious, and she clearly expected David to submit to her authority without question. David started to respond angrily, but Robert placed a restraining hand on his arm and stepped forward to address Margaret directly. Robert's bearing immediately conveyed authority and professionalism that contrasted sharply with Margaret's bluster. When he asked Margaret to explain the legal basis for her presence on private property, his tone was calm but carried an unmistakable note of official inquiry. Margaret initially responded with the same aggressive assertions she had used with David in previous encounters. She claimed that, as HOA president, she had the authority to inspect any property in the area, and that David's refusal to cooperate with community standards justified immediate enforcement action. She waved her copies of the HOA covenants as if they were legal documents that granted her broad police powers. Robert listened patiently to Margaret's claims, while mentally cataloging the legal problems with every assertion she made. When she finished her explanation, he asked several pointed questions about the specific legal authority she claimed to possess. His questions were phrased in the careful language of someone with extensive legal training, and they clearly made Margaret uncomfortable, even though she tried to maintain her aggressive posture. The situation was rapidly developing into exactly the kind of confrontation that Robert had hoped to avoid during his weekend retreat, but his professional instincts had taken over. As State Attorney General, he had a responsibility to protect citizens from harassment and illegal assertions of authority. Margaret Thompson's behavior was crossing lines that Robert could not ignore even during his personal time. Bill Anderson and Carol Foster began to realize that the situation was not developing as Margaret had predicted. Robert's calm authority and pointed questions were clearly making Margaret defensive, and her responses were becoming increasingly shrill and less coherent. The two supporters began to exchange nervous glances as they realized that they might have made a serious mistake in accompanying Margaret. On this enforcement action, David watched the interaction with growing satisfaction as he saw Margaret's confidence beginning to crack under Robert's professional questioning. His friend was clearly in his element as he systematically exposed the flaws in Margaret's legal reasoning without raising his voice or displaying any anger. It was like watching a master craftsman demonstrate his skills. Margaret's frustration with Robert's questions finally boiled over, and she demanded to know who he thought he was to question her authority as HOA president. She accused him of interfering with legitimate community enforcement actions and threatened to have him removed from the property for trespassing. Her voice was becoming shrill and her gestures increasingly dramatic as she sensed that her authority was being challenged in ways she couldn't handle. Robert's response to Margaret's outburst was delivered in the same calm, professional tone he had maintained throughout the confrontation. He identified himself as Robert Williams, State Attorney General, and explained that he was present at the cabin as David's invited guest. The effect of this revelation on Margaret and her companions was immediate and dramatic. Margaret's face went pale as the implications of Robert's identity sank in. She had just spent several minutes asserting illegitimate authority over private property, while making legal threats against someone who was not only David's friend, but also the state's chief law enforcement officer. Her aggressive posturing suddenly seemed not just inappropriate, but potentially catastrophic for her personal legal situation. Bill Anderson and Carol Foster immediately began backing toward their vehicle as they realized that their participation in what they had believed was a legitimate enforcement action had actually involved them in harassment of a private citizen in the presence of the state attorney general. Their earlier confidence in Margaret's authority evaporated as they understood that they might now be facing serious legal consequences. Robert continued his professional assessment of the situation by asking Margaret to explain the specific legal an authority that gave her HOA the right to assert control over David's property. When Margaret fumbled for an answer, Robert explained that the HOA's covenants and bylaws could only apply to properties that had voluntarily agreed to be subject to those restrictions. Since David's property predated the HOA and had never been part of the development, there was no legal mechanism by which the association could assert authority over his land. Margaret attempted to argue that community standards and property values justified the HOA's actions, but Robert patiently explained that good intentions did not create legal authority. He pointed out that her continued harassment campaign against David, despite clear legal advice that the HOA lacked jurisdiction, could potentially constitute a violation of David's civil rights under state law. The legal education that Robert was providing was clearly having an impact on all three Pine Ridge residents, but Margaret was still reluctant to concede that her entire approach had been legally groundless. She attempted to argue that the HOA had implied authority to protect community interests, but Robert systematically dismantled each of her arguments with references to relevant statutes and case law. David was impressed by his friend's patient but thorough demolition of Margaret's legal theories. Robert never raised his voice or displayed anger, but his professional expertise was devastatingly effective in exposing the fundamental flaws in the HOA's position. It was clear that Margaret had never encountered someone with the knowledge and authority to effectively challenge her tactics. As the legal discussion continued, Margaret's supporters became increasingly eager to distance themselves from the situation. Bill Anderson mumbled something about having made a mistake and began walking toward his car. Carol Foster followed quickly behind him after offering a brief apology to David for the intrusion. Within minutes, Margaret found herself standing alone, facing the state attorney general. With her legal theories in tatters, Robert concluded his analysis of the situation by explaining to Margaret that her continued harassment of David could result in both civil and criminal liability. He pointed out that trespassing on private property while making false claims of authority could be prosecuted as criminal trespass, and that her pattern of harassment might also constitute a civil rights violation. The potential consequences were serious and could include both fines and imprisonment. Margaret's response to this legal reality check was a mixture of anger and fear. She clearly had not anticipated that her enforcement actions might have serious legal consequences for her personally. Her understanding of HOA authority had been based on assumptions, rather than legal research, and she was now facing the uncomfortable reality that she had been operating outside the law. Robert suggested that Margaret might want to consult with an attorney about her legal situation and consider whether continuing her harassment campaign against David was worth the potential consequences. He made it clear that as State Attorney General, he would be monitoring the situation and would not hesitate to take appropriate action if the harassment continued. The confrontation that Margaret had expected to resolve in her favor through aggressive assertion of claimed authority had instead exposed her to serious legal jeopardy while accomplishing none of her objectives. Her attempt to intimidate David in front of witnesses had backfired spectacularly when one of those witnesses turned out to be the state's chief law enforcement officer. Margaret gathered her materials and retreated to her vehicle in a state of shocked confusion. The confident HOA president, who had arrived expecting to assert her authority over David's property, was leaving as a potentially liable defendant in a civil rights case. Her parting words were a mumbled promise to consult with the HOA's attorney about the situation. David and Robert watched Margaret drive away before returning to their interrupted fishing expedition. David thanked his friend for handling the situation with such professional skill and restraint. Robert explained that people like Margaret Thompson often created problems for themselves by assuming that aggressive behavior could substitute for legal authority. The morning's dramatic confrontation had resolved David's HOA problem in a way that his attorney's letters had been unable to accomplish. Margaret Thompson's direct encounter with the state attorney general had provided a lesson in legal reality that was unlikely to be forgotten. However, the implications of the confrontation would extend far beyond David's individual situation. Robert explained to David that Margaret's behavior represented a pattern he had seen in other HOA disputes around the state. Some homeowners associations had developed cultures of aggressive enforcement that sometimes crossed legal boundaries. The problem was serious enough that Robert had been considering whether additional legislation might be needed to clarify the limits of HOA authority and protect property owners from harassment. David's case would provide Robert with a perfect example of the problems that could arise when HOAs overstep their authority. The documentation that David had collected, combined with the morning's confrontation, would serve as compelling evidence of the need for clearer legal boundaries and stronger protections for property owners who found themselves in similar situations. As they resumed their fishing, Robert and David discussed the broader implications of the HOA controversy. They agreed that while homeowners associations served legitimate purposes in many communities, the potential for abuse was significant when leadership fell into the hands of people like Margaret Thompson, who confused personal preferences with legal authority. The peaceful lake setting seemed to underscore the absurdity of Margaret's claims that David's well-maintained cabin somehow threatened community standards. The property was clearly cared for and posed no threat to anyone's property values or quality of life. It had been based on a desire for control rather than any legitimate community concern. David reflected on how the morning's events had changed his situation. Instead of facing continued harassment from an aggressive HOA president, he now had the protection of the state attorney general's official interest in his case. Margaret Thompson would have to think very carefully before attempting any further enforcement actions against his property. Robert assured David that the legal protections for property owners in situations like this were strong once properly invoked. The problem was that many people lacked the knowledge or resources to effectively challenge HOA overreach. Case would help highlight these issues and potentially lead to improved protections for other property owners facing similar harassment. The two friends spent the rest of the morning fishing and discussing various legal and political topics unrelated to HOA disputes. The earlier confrontation had been resolved so decisively that it seemed to clear the air for a genuinely relaxing weekend. David felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders now that the HOA problem was finally behind him. As they prepared lunch, David realized that the morning's events would have lasting consequences beyond his personal situation. Robert's presence during Margaret's attempted enforcement action had created a perfect case study of HOA overreach that would likely influence policy discussions at the state level. Eight's aggressive HOA president, who had sought to intimidate a private property owner, had instead provided evidence for stronger legal protections for people in similar situations. The afternoon passed peacefully, with more fishing and relaxed conversation between old friends. The beautiful lake setting and perfect weather made it easy to forget the morning's drama and focus on enjoying each other's company. However, both men knew that the implications of Margaret Thompson's failed enforcement action would continue to develop in the weeks and months ahead. As evening approached, David prepared a campfire while Robert gathered wood from the forest around the cabin. The simple domestic tasks felt especially satisfying after the morning's confirmation that David's right to enjoy his property without harassment had been definitively established. The HOA controversy that had been a source of stress for months was finally resolved. The campfire provided a perfect setting for continued conversation about legal issues, policy questions, and their respective careers. Robert's work as Attorney General involved constant attention to the balance between legitimate authority and individual rights. David's case had provided a clear example of what happened when that balance was disrupted by people who confused personal preferences with legal power. David asked Robert about other HOA cases he had encountered in his official capacity. Robert explained that complaints about HOA overreach were becoming increasingly common across the state. Many of these cases involved associations that had exceeded their legal authority or engaged in harassment of property owners who challenged their decisions. The pattern was troubling and suggested a need for clearer legal guidelines. Robert described several cases where HOAs had attempted to assert authority over properties that were not legally subject to their covenants. These cases typically involved associations that had grown beyond their original boundaries and attempted to bring neighboring properties under their control through intimidation rather than legal process. Margaret Thompson's behavior fit this pattern perfectly. The legal remedies available to property owners in these situations were strong, but often required expensive litigation to enforce. Many people faced with HOA harassment lacked the resources to challenge illegitimate assertions of authority through the courts. This created opportunities for aggressive HOA leaders to succeed through intimidation, even when their legal position was weak. David realized that his situation had been unusual because he had access to legal advice and ultimately to the state Attorney General himself. Most people facing similar harassment would have to fight their battles without such resources. This made Robert's interest in his case particularly significant because it might lead to improved protections for other property owners. Robert explained that one potential solution would be legislation creating expedited procedures for challenging HOA actions that exceeded legal authority. Such procedures could provide property owners with faster and less expensive remedies when faced with harassment or illegitimate enforcement actions. The goal would be to level the playing field between individual property owners and well-funded associations. Another potential reform would be clearer penalties for HOA leaders who knowingly exceeded their legal authority. Currently, the legal consequences for HOA overreach were primarily civil, which meant that aggressive leaders might calculate that the benefits of successful intimidation outweighed the risks of being sued. Criminal penalties for harassment and false assertions of authority might provide a stronger deterrent. David was intrigued by the possibility that his experience with Margaret Thompson might contribute to legal reforms that would help other property owners. The idea that the morning's confrontation might have positive consequences beyond his personal situation gave additional meaning to what had been a stressful several months of dealing with HOA harassment. As the evening progressed and the campfire burned down, David and Robert reflected on the day's events and their broader significance. What had started as a peaceful weekend at the cabin had become a dramatic illustration of the tensions between individual property rights and community authority. The resolution had been swift and decisive, but the underlying issues were complex and deserving of continued attention. Robert's professional interest in the case would continue beyond their weekend at the cabin. He planned to have his staff research similar situations across the state and consider whether legislative action might be appropriate. David's documentation of Margaret Thompson's harassment, the campaign would provide valuable evidence for policy discussions about HOA reform. The two friends eventually retired to the cabin, satisfied that the day had ended much better than it had begun. Margaret Thompson's attempted intimidation had backfired completely, and David's property rights had been definitively established. However, the most important outcome might be the attention that the case would bring to the broader problem of HOA overreach and the need for stronger protections for individual property owners. The following morning, David and Robert enjoyed a leisurely breakfast. While discussing their plans for the day, the peaceful lake setting seemed even more beautiful after the previous day's confirmation that David's right to enjoy his property had been protected. There was no sign of Margaret Thompson or any other Pine Ridge residents, and the tranquility that David valued so highly had been restored. Robert prepared to return to the capital, where he would resume his official duties, but promised to stay in touch about developments related to the HOA case. He explained that his staff would be researching similar situations across the state and considering various policy options for addressing the problem of association overreach. David's case would serve as an important example in these discussions. Before leaving, Robert provided David with his direct contact information and assured him that any future problems with the HOA should be reported immediately. While Margaret Thompson had been effectively deterred by the previous day's encounter, there was always a possibility that she might attempt some form of retaliation or that other HOA leaders might try similar tactics. David thanked his friend for the professional support and personal friendship that had resolved his HOA problem so decisively. Without Robert's presence during Margaret's attempted enforcement action, the harassment might have continued indefinitely with increasing intensity. The state attorney general's intervention had provided both immediate relief and long-term protection that would have been impossible to achieve through other means. As Robert drove away, David reflected on the remarkable turn of events that had transformed his situation from harassment victim to protected property owner in the span of a single morning. Margaret Thompson's aggressive tactics had been based on the assumption that she could intimidate David into compliance through force of personality and claimed authority. Her failure to consider that he might have influential friends had led to her complete defeat. The legal education that Robert had provided to Margaret and her supporters would have lasting effects on their behavior. The Pine Ridge HOA would be much more careful about asserting authority beyond their legal boundaries now that they understood the potential consequences. Other property owners in the area would benefit from this new restraint, even if they never learned the details of what had happened at David's cabin. David spent the rest of the weekend enjoying the peace and tranquility that made his cabin such a valuable retreat. The knowledge that Margaret Thompson would not be returning to harass him allowed him to fully appreciate the natural beauty of the lake and surrounding forest. Every activity from fishing to reading to simply sitting by the water felt more satisfying. Now that the threat of unwanted interruption had been removed, the broader implications of the confrontation would continue to develop over the following weeks and months. Robert's interest in HOA reform would lead to policy discussions that might benefit property owners throughout the state. Margaret Thompson's failed enforcement action had provided a perfect case study of the problems that could arise when associations exceeded their legal authority. David's documentation of the HOA harassment campaign would serve as evidence in these policy discussions. The letters, threats, and illegal enforcement actions that had seemed so troubling when he was dealing with them alone would now contribute to legal reforms that might prevent other property owners from facing similar problems. As David prepared to return to his weekday life in the city, he felt grateful for the peaceful resolution of what had been a months-long source of stress and frustration, HOA controversy that had threatened to poison. His enjoyment of the family cabin had been resolved in the most dramatic and decisive way possible. Margaret Thompson's attempt to assert illegitimate authority had backfired completely and exposed her to serious legal jeopardy. The drive home gave David time to process the full significance of what had happened at the cabin. Margaret Thompson's harassment campaign had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about HOA authority and property law. Her assumption that aggressive tactics could substitute for legal power had led to complete failure. When confronted by someone with actual legal expertise and authority, David realized that many people facing similar harassment from HOAs or other organizations lacked the resources and connections that had allowed him to resolve his situation so effectively. Robert's presence during Margaret's enforcement attempt had been fortunate, but most property owners would not have such protection available. This made the potential policy reforms that Robert was considering even more important. The experience had also taught David valuable lessons about standing up to illegitimate authority. His initial inclination had been to try to reason with Margaret and find some compromise that would end the harassment. However, Robert's approach had demonstrated that some situations required firm resistance rather than accommodation. Margaret's behavior had been legally wrong and morally unjustifiable and deserved to be challenged directly. In the weeks following the confrontation at the cabin, David received confirmation that Margaret Thompson had indeed consulted with an attorney about her legal situation. The HOA's lawyer had apparently provided a harsh assessment of Margaret's actions and their potential consequences. The Pine Ridge Board had voted to remove Margaret as president and had issued a formal apology to David for the harassment campaign. The new HOA leadership had also implemented new policies requiring legal review before any enforcement actions outside the development boundaries. These changes would prevent future situations like the one Margaret had created and would protect other property owners from similar harassment. The reforms were a direct result of the legal education that Robert had provided during the confrontation. At David's cabin, Robert kept David informed about the policy discussions that his case had inspired at the state level. Several legislators had expressed interest in HOA reform. Legislation and hearings were being planned to examine the problem of association overreach. David's documentation of Margaret Thompson's harassment campaign would be used as evidence in these discussions. The proposed reforms included expedited procedures for challenging HOA actions that exceeded legal authority, stronger penalties for leaders who knowingly violated property owners' rights, and clearer guidelines about the limits of association power. These changes would provide better protection for individual property owners while preserving the legitimate functions of homeowners associations. David was pleased to learn that his experience with Margaret Thompson might contribute to legal reforms that would help other property owners facing similar problems. What had been a personal ordeal had become an opportunity to improve the system for everyone. Margaret's aggressive tactics had ultimately backfired not just in her confrontation with David, but in creating momentum for statewide policy changes. Cabin remained David's peaceful retreat, but now had additional significance as the site where an important lesson about property rights and legal authority had been taught. Margaret Thompson's failed enforcement action had provided an example of what happened when personal preferences were confused with legal power. The state attorney general's intervention had protected not just David's rights, but had established principles that would benefit many other property owners. Several months later, David received news that Margaret Thompson had moved away from the Pine Ridge development. The legal and social consequences of her harassment campaign had apparently made her position in the community untenable. Her replacement as HOA president had adopted a much more restrained approach to association governance that focused on legitimate community concerns rather than attempts to expand HOA authority. The Pine Ridge development had also benefited from the changes in leadership and policies. Property values had remained stable and community relations had improved under the new management approach. The aggressive enforcement tactics that Margaret had championed had been replaced by reasonable policies that balanced community standards. With individual property rights, David's relationship with his neighbors in the Pine Ridge development had also improved significantly. Many residents had been uncomfortable with Margaret's tactics, but had felt unable to challenge her leadership. The dramatic failure of her enforcement campaign against David had provided an opportunity for more reasonable voices to emerge in the community. The legal reforms that Robert had initiated were making progress through the state legislature. Proposed changes had received support from both property rights advocates and responsible HOA leaders who recognized that associations needed clear boundaries on their authority. The legislation would provide better protection for individual property owners while preserving the legitimate functions of homeowners associations. David testified at one of the legislative hearings about his experience with HOA harassment. Account of Margaret Thompson's campaign and its ultimate failure provided compelling evidence for the need for legal reforms. The legislators were particularly interested in his documentation of the escalating harassment and the dramatic confrontation that had finally ended it. The testimony also highlighted the importance of having legal resources available to property owners facing HOA harassment. David's access to legal advice, and ultimately to the state attorney general, had been crucial to his successful resistance. The proposed reforms would provide similar resources to other property owners who might not have such connections. Roberts' role in resolving David's case had also demonstrated the importance of having law enforcement officials who understood property rights issues and were willing to protect citizens from harassment. The state attorney general's intervention had provided immediate protection and had established legal precedents that would benefit other property owners facing similar problems.